Well, actually, that archaeology as a political animal is somewhat unavoidable these days, and so I would submit that it's a good idea to possibly try and get it out of the way as our first segment of the month, and that is the implications of the Brexit withdrawal bill.
And you realise people are now side swiping to get rid of this and go on to look at the latest video on
Yeah.
YouTube,
What's
don't you?
next? What's next? No, no, no.
Absolutely.
No, seriously, stick around, folks. Stick around because this it is interesting. In a grown-up way, but it is interesting because what we are seeing is a process by which obviously Britain is trying to leave the European Union, and for the past, certainly for my lifetime, the past several decades. There's been such an integration of general European law, but also sovereign law, and this applies to all the member states, such that everyday standards, protections, laws, and regulations are currently having to be analysed as to whether or not they will make that jump from European statute to the British statute books upon leaving the European Union. And this has particular implications for archaeologists and the historic environment, and also actually the environment in general, the agricultural environment, but also the natural environment. All of these different policies are very much intertwined, but they're also very much based, at the moment at least, in European standards. And, well, depending on your perspective, this is a moment ripe with possibilities. You could see this as a possibility to modify those standards to help development, for example, in this country, or you could see this as an opportunity actually to modify those standards to intertwine environmental protection and heritage protection. We're on a knife edge, and well, I mean, give it to me gently. How might this affect commercial archaeology in the UK?
The problem lies in two provisions of the Lisbon Treaty, which underlies current European Union EU practice, which were given at least two principles that were given treaty strength, treaty grade strength, if you like, in the Lisbon Treaty. One is what is called the Precautionary Principle, which
Hmm.
basically says that anybody making any kind of impact on the natural or heritage environment has to take the precaution of assessing what that impact might be. So in archaeological terms, that means doing a desktop study of, say, a development site where you want to build a housing estate,
Hmm. Hmm.
and assessing what archaeology might be there. When you've done that, the precautionary principle says that you either move the site 20 meters to the left to miss the archaeology, or you undertake archaeology to mitigate the damage that you're going to cause by building a house in the middle of a Roman villa.
Hmm.
And that's where the second principle comes in, and that's what's called the polluter pays principle. Now, in this case, pollution isn't just pouring oil in a river. It's seen in the treaty terms as any wider damage to the environment, historical or natural environment in general. So again, somebody building a housing estate on a Roman villa is damaging the historical environment. Therefore, the polluter pays principle kicks in.
So in this instance, it's a very broad definition of pollution. So vandalism or an adverse effect on environment as pollution, and therefore the person who enacts those adverse effects pays. Polluter pays.
That's exactly
Hmm.
right. And that principle underpins really the modern structure of UK developer-funded archaeology, as it's called,
Hmm.
commercial archaeology, as it's sometimes called, where you have large units like MOLA, Museum of London Archaeology, like Wessex Archaeology, and the other big units who undertake this work for developers.
Hmm.
And you can see that with something like the HS2 railway or the proposed Heathrow runway, new runway, there will be a huge amount of work there for archaeologists. At the same time, if the requirement was rowed back on
Hmm.
post Brexit, then that could have a major impact on the archaeology sector, because, being brutal, that's where most of the jobs are at the moment, in commercial archaeology and developer funded work.
Well, it is, and also, the thing is, I mean, you mentioned the larger units like Wessex and Mola and this kind of thing, but also actually there are lots of small, bands of brothers and sisters, as it were, around the country who set up their own little units that provide not so much the big, estate-wide building projects, but maybe someone's developing an extension, and so they bring in a little unit to do that job. This is bread and butter work for archaeologists across the country.
That's absolutely right, and there is just this week we've seen the government announcing that in areas like London in particular, where there's particular pressure to build new houses, and also in last week's budget from the Chancellor, Philip Hammond, the desire on the part of the government to develop smaller sites that are available for housing.
Mm-hmm,
so you're quite right, the sites that wouldn't be economically viable for the bigger units are viable for the smaller sole traders or smaller local units that you're talking about.
And locally, actually, literally the council archaeology unit, which was disbanded because of a lack of funds on a local authority level and ultimately a government budget setting level. They literally fell into their own they created their own unit. So this has been their fallback, and this may be about to be under threat. And on top of that, it's worthwhile just saying that this also could undermine this sort of 2 to 3 year promise we've been getting as archaeologists that HS2 is going to reinvigorate the profession. If these laws aren't somehow translated successfully or modified in a way which is useful in terms of protection, then actually HS2 could simply be a steamroller building project that doesn't require any archaeological intervention.
The problem at the moment is there's a school of thought. There's always been a school of thought in the world of particularly property developers that in their terms, and the term has been used, that the requirement to do any environmental studies, particularly archaeology, is a tax on progress or a tax on house building. And they see it as an unnecessary cost, particularly when the government is wanting to build tens of thousands of more extra houses a year. And in fact, there was even a recent paper from one of the building organisations, which was commissioned from the former head of development for the City of London Corporation, who in the course of that paper, archaeology was described as a nice to have, but one where we'd have to consider whether it was important to retain it given other priorities.
And this is where I feel obliged to mention that there is actually a genuine there is a discussion to be had there, in so much as in previous videos in this Watching Brief series we have talked about development and protection of sites, in particular, for example, sites in London that have to be rebuilt and this kind of thing. And that has actually sparked very passionate conversation in the comments section of those videos, where people have essentially said, archaeologists are trying to just to be an obstacle. They're getting in the way of progress. They want to defend their own profession for the sake of having it. And I suppose that's where I feel compelled just to say that for those people, that I'm by no means believe that everything should be saved. I don't think that every piece of archaeology has merit and has to be literally kept in place, but it should at the very least have an opportunity to be recorded, I think. And that's possibly where some of this misunderstanding comes from. There's this perception, perhaps, especially from a developer standpoint, that beyond the bill of paying for it, that also archaeologists are somehow the artifactual equivalent of tree huggers, that we just want to get in the way and prevent building projects and prevent, for example, people getting affordable housing, which is very necessary at the moment. And I would say that's not the case.
As one of the lowest paid professions in the country, archaeologists will be particular beneficiaries of affordable housing.
Yeah. Well, actually, I mean, we were joking at the beginning of this month's Watching Brief about the difference between the northeast of England and London. But one of the reasons why we could afford a house is because the northeast of England is so deprived economically. We're trapped here. We can't in that sense sell our house and move elsewhere. So as far as affordable housing goes, yeah, absolutely, archaeologists, we need it. But I think that this is all. Once again, this all has to be about balance, and this really, I suppose, comes back to the question of what is government for. Government, I would submit, is ideally there to represent the people. It's not there to represent a political agenda or indeed a subset of the people, such as developers. And so one would hope that out of this process would come an approach that acknowledges, yes, we need possibly to make it easy for developers, but also we need to acknowledge that an awful lot of value, cultural and economic, comes from having these protections in place. I don't know. Where do you see these conversations going? Do you think there is actually a serious risk? Genuine that in the future archaeology simply won't be done unless it's a luxurious private excavation on private land?
I think at the moment the risk is that we'll go back to a less regulated environment. I think it's clear that there are, if Brexit goes ahead, as certainly the what's called the hard Brexit wing of the cabinet, people like Boris Johnson, Michael Gove, are concerned, then there will be a rowing back on some regulations put down by the government in the name of economic growth. Now, how far that goes, I think, depends on two things. It depends on how strong the government is, and the current government is not strong. It's barely got a majority, even with the DUP, Democratic Unionist MPs. So it will be difficult to do anything quickly. And in fact, the amendment that would have retained the two principles under the withdrawal bill only barely scraped through with the majority. I think it was of 14 votes and 16 votes.
Right.
So and in fact, when the bill goes to the House of Lords, it's likely to be amended again. And if MPs get a big enough postbag on it, and certainly all the groups across the environmental sector, heritage and natural, are mobilising on this one, there'll be a lot of pressure to bring it back into the bill. So I think, at the moment, it's very difficult to predict. The worst case scenario is that, there will be the hard Brexiteers will win, the economic neoliberal libertarians will win, and what we'll end up with is a lot less regulation. And the other key thing, actually, is less opportunities to hold local and national government to account on these things. One of the benefits of having the polluter pays principle and the precautionary principle in EU treaty is that in the most egregious cases you can make a complaint to the European Court of Justice that EU law hasn't been respected in putting down a housing estate on top of a Roman villa. It was properly considered in the planning process, and people who've taken the decisions can be held to account. That option wouldn't be available if in the way things are currently configured.
Right. Okay. So something to keep an eye on, I guess, and if necessary, if people feel impassioned to do so, to bring this to the attention of their MP, I suppose. And
I think we should actually say, having perhaps been slightly later to the feast than the natural environment sector, the archaeological sector is now gearing itself up to campaign on this. CIfA have issued a statement saying that they support the retention of the two principles and will be lobbying. So have the CBA. So that's the two leading representative organisations, and also in terms of in terms of the lobby groups, Rescue are currently circulating a letter for archaeologists to sign asking for the principles to be retained, and that's designed to go to all members of the House of Lords and the House of Commons. Okay.
Well, okay. Again, this stuff is kind of unavoidable at the moment, isn't it? Talking about what seems like potentially a very dry topic, or a very, very overtly political topic. But ultimately, as I say, I do believe that across the political spectrum, people genuinely want to see history preserved for whatever most people, but by that I mean to say whatever their particular agendas are. Some people have, I would say, very odd agendas when it comes to history, but nonetheless they don't want to see it destroyed. So hopefully people can come together on this, and we'll see some form of protection in British law come 2020, I guess.
Yeah, I think we need to emphasise it won't be that everything goes. It might be that the environment becomes a lot more permissive for developers.
Yeah, which might not be a bad thing. I mean,
We're having the argument now,
it's
aren't we?
so complicated. It's so complicated. Anyway, moving on. Moving on. We've done it. We've handled the dry political story for the month.
And if it's okay, exactly, and the member of the audience who stayed with us can now get their friends back into the room and make them watch the rest of the podcast.
Yes. That one person, that one angry person, can now can now be joined by others.